It is Saturday, April 29th, 2017. This is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, or you could just call it a Seahawks Draft Recap podcast. We're just talking about the Seahawks here today. And who is we? It's myself, Kenneth Arthur, of fieldgoals.com, and as always, of SeahawksDraftBlog.com, Rob Staten. And so we are going to go over yesterday on Friday, myself and Rob, we recapped the Seahawks draft picks on round 2 and then stayed live for their picks in round 3. If you're interested in listening to those reviews of those players that they took, like Malik McDowell, you can go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com or fieldgoals.com to get the latest from SoundCloud, or you can subscribe on iTunes at Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur for the latest for what we did on Friday with rounds 2 and 3. But now we're talking about day 3, rounds 4 through 7. The Seahawks added 5 new players to the draft, have been working through undrafted free agency to add more as well. And we are going to talk about the players that are new into the fold for the Seattle Seahawks because of these most recent draft picks. The draft is mercilessly over. And as you can tell, it's been a draining one. But the Seahawks had a pick in the 4th round. They had traded it last year to the Patriots so that they could draft Quentin Jefferson in 2016. But they added a pick when they moved down with the 49ers, a 4th-round pick. And I think it's always good to keep that perspective. So when you see like the Seahawks are adding a player in the 4th round or the 6th round or the 7th round, as they did today, all picks added in just small move downs that, in terms of what John Schneider will tell you, didn't cost them anything. So with that being said, the Seahawks in the 4th round, pick 111 from the 49ers through the Bears. The Seahawks select free safety Tedric Thompson out of Colorado. Rob, you wrote about Tedric Thompson earlier this year. You had a positive opinion about him, it seems, through the draft on Twitter after they drafted him. You want to expand on your thoughts on Tedric Thompson and what he means for the Seahawks?
Yeah, I really liked Tedric Thompson. There's a few different Colorado players to go and watch. So, and they had a really good season. So 2 things really. I kind of ended up watching them a few times anyway, and then going back to look at people like Akella Witherspoon or Chidobe Awuzie or people like that. Had a reason to watch them, and there was this one guy who constantly kept making plays and stood out like a sore thumb, really, and that was Tedric Thompson. I think that the really interesting thing is that he showed great range. So whenever teams are throwing deep, he would cover a lot of ground. Similar to the best free safeties in the league. He had a knack of making a play on the ball. He took the ball away, had 7 interceptions. He was a playmaker, and you just thought, yeah, this is a really good player. His brother, who is amazingly called Cedric, Tedric and Cedric, was a former draft pick for, I think, the Miami Dolphins took him in the 5th round not so long ago, and had this tremendous workout at the combine. So it was sort of watching him on the tape, seeing the athleticism, and then sort of seeing that he'd got a brother who had also had a really good combine. It was easy to think he's going to have a great combine as well. The tape's great. He looks athletic. It's all going to come together. And then he got to the combine and didn't perform as well as expected. Didn't perform anywhere near as well as his brother. I think he ran in the 4.6s. Didn't have the most explosive workout. Cedric was much more athletic in that regard. And yet, what you see on the video was just constant, really athletic plays. So I think that sometimes the numbers don't match up to what you actually see there. And I think he is a lot more athletic than his combine suggests. I think that he is a really interesting player, and I think he's strictly a free safety. I think he's basically going to be there to be a bit of depth for Earl. When they lost Earl Thomas, it was a major blow last year, and they can't really afford to do that again. And they've gone out and taken someone who was a major playmaker, who can cover a lot of ground and can be, a backup for Earl, which is a very important role, as we saw when he went out. And just a final thing on Tedric Thompson, incredibly productive as well, because he had 7 interceptions last year. He had, I think it was 23 passes defended or something, 22, 23, which was the most in the country. He had 6 pass breakups, and he had I think it was something like 1.64 passes defended a game, which is, considerably more than anybody else I could find. So he has the production. I think he is a good athlete. I think he fills a big position for the Seahawks in terms of backing up Earl Thomas. I think that Tedric Thompson pick in the 4th round is a really good pick. Big thumbs up for that pick.
It feels good, to get more safety help back there. Steven Terrell not working out for Seattle last year after Earl Thomas did go down. And just knowing that Earl Thomas still has a broken leg that, or not, maybe it's not, I don't know if it's officially broken or not. I'm not a doctor, but, maybe one day I'll get started on that train towards becoming a doctor. I've done nothing so far. But in terms of Earl Thomas coming back next year, having more security there at the safety position is going to be important for the Seahawks, because we saw how much their defense fell apart without Earl Thomas. We've seen it have struggles in the past without Cam Chancellor. And they always felt comfortable to have those safeties behind them, though we never really knew if they were good or not, like Steven Terrell. And then we found out the only way that you really can find out, which is the hard way. So a 4th round safety is pretty high, especially for this team, knowing that the Seahawks, had never drafted a secondary player other than Earl Thomas higher than the 4th round. The other, in the 4th rounder being Walter Thurman, and then, getting Cam Chancellor in the 5th round. This is a pretty solid high-ish pick for the Seahawks to get Tedric Thompson at this place. And obviously, he'll be one of the favorites to make the roster last year as the main backup, but the Seahawks didn't shy away from, targeting safeties in this draft. Moving down, they didn't have, like I said, they didn't have a 4th round pick, and they didn't have a 5th round pick. So their next selection would come at the top of the 6th round, and they select Michael Tyson out of Cincinnati, another safety at 6'1", 204 pounds, though the early reports being that the Seahawks and Pete Carroll seemed to like what Mike Tyson could bring as a press cover corner and less of as a safety. So it seems like with Mike Tyson, that's going to be the plan for right now, which is to put him at corner and put him that competition there. Rob, I know that, you haven't done any research or much research on Mike Tyson so far. Obviously, that's something we'll find out in the coming days and weeks, more into who this guy is as a player. But in terms of the Seahawks competition at cornerback, knowing that you've got Jeremy Lane and knowing the full class now, basically for the Seahawks and what they did and didn't do in free agency, how do you feel about that outside and slot corner position right now?
Well, just on Tyson quickly, I haven't seen much of his tape at all, and he's one of the players I'm most looking forward to getting into over the next few days. But there is something sort of worth noting here, is that Seattle's defense, and in general, the 4-2-5 scheme, which a lot of teams are running these days, it really sort of puts a strong emphasis on having safe cornerbacks who have the ability to play safety or have got safety size. And Seattle wants physicality. You've got to be able to press, you've got to match up, you've got to be competitive, you've got to be good in run support. And one of the features of this cornerback class was that not a lot of them were particularly good tacklers. It wasn't something that was exclusive to Ahkello Witherspoon here. There was not a lot of good tackling cornerbacks. So Seattle taking a safety who maybe is a good tackler, who can convert to cornerback, was something that seemed quite likely. It was just trying to find the guy who could do it. The other thing is it's a much longer safety class. There were 13 safeties that I could find that had a really sort of unique wingspan, which is above 77.5 inches. And there was only 6 in the cornerback class who had that kind of length. So it sort of stood to reason that they were going to do this at some point, take a really athletic safety and then convert him to cornerback. It's since come out that this is the problem with the arm length measurements and everything like this. I have no idea why it's not consistent. You had guys going to the Senior Bowl who would have really short arms, then they would gain an inch and a half at the combine because the measurements are different. And Tyson at the combine was measured as having 31 3/4 inch arms, which is not very Seattle-esque. And then John Schneider just said in his press conference a few moments ago that he's actually got 32.5 inch arms. So I don't understand why there's this kind of disparity between arm length and stuff like that. But nevertheless, he's there. He had 4.5 tackles for a loss last year, so he can do some good tackling in the backfield as well. That's kind of in the Chidobe Awuzie kind of range for making plays in the backfield. So I think he's an interesting pick. And the depth they've got now, they needed some depth at safety. They've got that. They've got options with Delano Hill and Bradley McDougald in the big nickel if they want to play that third safety. Pete Carroll keeps talking that, it's got effusive praise really for Bradley McDougall, and you kind of get the sense that the way that he's talking about him, that they see him as a starter, that they see him as the big nickel essentially, and Hill's going to have to win that job. If not, Hill can play a bit of strong safety if he needs to. If Cam misses time, will probably have a key role on special teams. So I think the safety depth, and with Tedric Thompson coming in as well, is pretty good. Shaq Griffin there at cornerback. You know, someone asked me earlier, is there a chance that Shaq Griffin could play as a rookie? And you'd never count that out, not with the way that Pete Carroll handles things. You know, if he wins the competition, he will win the competition. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to win that job straight out the gate, because he's going to have to learn the technique. He has had some issues where he's got beat deep. He's going to have to rectify his technique a little bit, but he is this incredible athlete, and he is tenacious, and he is physical, and he is strong. He's got a great personality. So, you know, I think over time they will view him. You know, can we develop him to become this outside cornerback? I think for the time being, though, he's probably going to join a competition and may not win that job, but they can feel generally quite happy about the competition and the depth there. And even if it's not Jeremy Lane who starts outside, they have got some guys they like, whether it's Pierre Desir, whether it is Nico Thorpe, or one of the other guys that they've got on the roster. You know, Deshaun Shedd may be healthy eventually next season. So they have got some guys that they like at cornerback. So it's not the draft that I think people were expecting a week ago, where they were thinking big splashes at cornerback, maybe drafting the next Sherman, the next Cam, the next Earl, players like that, and then sort of creating this new Legion of Boom with some big names that people are familiar with. I think that's kind of what people were expecting last week. What they've actually done is give themselves some more competition behind those guys and then focus on the trenches. For me, the focus of this draft has been physicality, building the trenches, trying to get back to sort of that 2013 defensive line rotation, trying to be the bully in the division again, trying to be the team that wins on the O-line and the D-line in the NFC West, rather than ceding that position to the Rams and the Cardinals.
Yeah, when you look at the Seahawks secondary overall, you know, it was an area of concern, the biggest need, as some people would put it, outside of offensive line. But now coming out of the draft, you know, Richard Sherman was not traded. So, you know, we can assume that unless something happens during the preseason, you know, in that time of year, Richard Sherman will not be traded. So they still have an all-pro level cornerback at that position. They still have Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor at their safety positions. They now have a competition for those other two spots that includes players like, you know, 2 third-round picks in Shaq Griffin and Delano Hill, Jeremy Lane, DeAndre Elliott, Pierre Desir, Nico Thorpe, and now, you know, Mike Tyson. And even if Mike Tyson doesn't work out, not only was he just a 6th-round pick, but he was a 6th-round pick that you didn't even have when you started the day on Friday. So they can just add that player, and if it doesn't work out, so be it. But there are a good 6 or 7 or 8 players in interesting competition there. And we don't know yet how Bradley McDougall and some of these other guys, Delano Hill and Shaq Griffin and such, will line up. But there's no shortage of interesting, talented competition. It's just a matter of finding out, because, you know, that position opposite of Richard Sherman has historically been filled by players that were not names up until they became starters there. Brandon Browner, Byron Maxwell, Deshaun Shedd. You know, it's the ones that didn't work out, like Kerry Williams, the ones that were names when they were added, not the ones. It's usually the ones that were not names at all up until they became a name through starting there. So plenty of competition. And, you know, if in having 3 corners out there on the same field, I still don't see it being. Right now, I see it being not so much of an issue. And third-round picks, like I said before, not shabby. So for them to have Shaq Griffin and Delano Hill added to the secondary in the 3rd round is big. So there's something there. And later on in the 6th round, you know, as I said, offensive line being the biggest need in many people's eyes, the Seahawks select Justin Senior. I believe he was a senior at Mississippi State, 6'5", 331 pounds. But I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Rob, because I can't imagine that Justin Senior had anything less than maybe the worst TEF score of all offensive linemen this year. Because at 331 pounds, he runs a 5.55. His shuttle of 8.19 was the 3rd slowest at the combine. His 98-inch broad jump was, you know, pretty small, 23-inch vertical leap. But even if you look at someone like Zach Banner, who had a longer shuttle time, Zach Banner weighed 22 more pounds. he was basically the same speed, basically had the same vertical leap. And, Justin Senior seems to be a worse athlete than that. But yet maybe the Seahawks going against the grain of what they had been doing in the past at offensive line isn't a bad call. So what are your thoughts on Justin Senior, and if this is a new strategy at offensive line to not look at athleticism?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much a new strategy because I think maybe in the past they have, or at least their sort of plan in the previous years was, let's get the most explosive guys we can get, and then we can coach them up. But ultimately, all the TEF score was a formula based around Tom Cable's preferred, his ideal. What is your ideal offensive lineman was the question. His answer was, 9 foot broad jump, 31-inch vertical, and 27 reps on the bench press. It's very specific, and it enabled us to make a formula. And it just so happened that they drafted towards that ideal. But an ideal doesn't have to be a clause-all thing. So if Tom Cable says, do you know what, my ideal guy looks like this, but I really like this guy who's not the ideal, it doesn't mean that they aren't going to draft them. It's just really a guide to help us kind of identify who the players are that they might target. And Posick was in the ballpark really for sort of to match the TEF score. With Senior, I heard the quote from John Schneider after well, he's just in his press conference now, and he said that ultimately he put on a lot of weight as a senior, that they felt that he gained too much weight. He admitted it was something they were going to have to look at, and it's one of the reasons why he fell to the 6th round. They felt that when he was lighter as a junior, that he was a much better player. And I just wonder if he is not in the best shape. He didn't look to be in the greatest shape at the Senior Bowl. I just wonder if they sort of think we can get this guy in shape, he will be more athletic, he will be better, and he has some of the characteristics that we actually really like. And I think that's probably what they view with him, that they see him as somebody who needs some proper nutrition guidance, a good weight training program, but as a 6th-round pick, he has got the potential to develop into something. That's how I think they will view him. Having watched a bit of him, especially at the Senior Bowl, he really struggled. He went to the Senior Bowl. I think he got an invite the week before the Senior Bowl. And maybe, I think he was going to go to the East-West Shrine game and then chose to go to the Senior Bowl instead. And when he got to the Senior Bowl, the first day of the drills with the pass rushers going one-on-one against the offensive lineman, he had a really, 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 really ugly session. I mean, it was difficult to watch because he was really, really getting dominated out there, and he had no answer. But then overall, it was a bad line that week. I think as the week grew on, you could see that he was improving and was taking to coaching. So that is something the Seahawks probably like about him as well. But make no doubt about it. I think they took George Fant in as an undrafted free agent a year ago, and he ended up playing left tackle for the Seahawks. I don't think that's going to happen with Justin Senior this year.
Well, and they say that they're going to be playing Justin Senior on the left tackle and working it out there, and we'll see what happens. I don't think that rookie mini camps are too far out. I mean, I think they're right around the corner. So, more things will be, taking on over the next few months, and we'll sort of see how that thing plays out. But, the Pete Carroll and John Schneider, one of the two, I think it was John Schneider, said that, asking for one player that they think would take a big step up next year, calling out George Fant to be that guy. And it's interesting, given their draftees and given their signings of like Luke Jokel and Ode Ibushi and moving Jermaine Ifedi to right tackle and drafting Posick, like where they think that how they end up, these 5 guys end up or how the 5 positions end up out of these 10 to 12 guys that are competing for jobs is going to be very interesting. And at least they've got some varied and, different competition and different players playing for these spots. And we'll see what happens though, not having continuity again after last year, somewhat concerning if they don't have very much continuity, but at the same time, if it was that bad at certain positions, continuity and keeping the same guys around also not necessarily the best game plan. So the Seahawks in the 7th round, they had a pick from the Carolina Panthers that came via a trade of Kevin Norwood a couple years ago. So a really good move for them to just get a free pick for a player that wasn't doing anything for anyone. Kevin Norwood providing the Seahawks with a 7th-round pick, and they used that on another wide receiver, David Moore, out of East Central Oklahoma, a Division II school. There's nothing really known about David Moore for the most part. If you go on YouTube, good luck finding some highlights. I haven't found any yet. It's a small school, but not a small player, with apparently John Schneider saying that he was a stud and, quote, strapped up at 219 pounds and timed about a 4.38 40-yard dash, according to Davis Sue on Twitter. So 219 pounds, 6'2", 4.38 40 total project. We can't really say much about what we think about David Moore because nobody really knows. Rob, do you have any further thoughts on David Moore?
No, there's very little information out there. He looks to be in terrific shape. He has good size, by about 6'1", 220, runs in the 4.3s, 4.4s type of range. Major athlete. Hopefully he can come in and provide the kind of athleticism that they've not really had, on special teams and within that receiver group since Ricardo Lockett was there. So it'd be nice to see him. I think his numbers physically match up very similarly to Amara Darboh. So it looks as if they're looking for a type of receiver that really does fit a certain profile. And it'll be very interesting to see if he can find some kind of a role here, or if he can impress a little bit, because it's going to be really difficult for him. Real small school guy. Probably in that range, they were taking priority free agents rather than sort of thinking, we're going to take this, we can draft this guy for this reason. It's the 7th round. You're taking probably priority free agents there. The guys you might not feel that you're going to sign up might not last to the end of the draft. So they took a chance on him, and from a 7th round pick, you just want them to give themselves a chance to make the roster, and we'll see if he can do that. It's going to be an uphill struggle for him because of the players they've got on the roster already, because they've already taken a receiver in the 3rd round. There's probably a better chance of Chris Carson, the 2nd, 7th rounder, of making this than he. But if he can get onto the practice squad, maybe then that'd be good for him, and can learn his trade like a lot of different receivers have done in Seattle over the years. That might not be such a bad thing.
Yeah, speaking of the offensive line competition, some interesting competitions will be happen at wide receiver and running back. If you look at wide receiver right now, Doug Baldwin, Tyler Lockett, those two might be the only two that feel super locked into a roster spot for next season. The others, I think would have very high probabilities, like Paul Richardson and Amara Darboh. I have my doubts about Jermaine Kearse, especially if Darboh, McAvoy, some of these other guys step up, because even after you get past the top 4, plus Darboh at 5, then you got McAvoy, Kenny Lawler, Kason Williams, Cyril Grayson, and now David Moore. What if David Moore is a stud? What if he can't pass to the practice squad? We'll find out, and then more moves will be happening. But even at running back, then you've got some other competitions going there, and that's what we can get into with this next pick, because right now you look at it and the Seahawks have Eddie Lacy and Thomas Rawls and CJ Prosise, and all 3 of those, if healthy, you think are guaranteed to make the final roster. So that depth there with Alex Collins, their 5th-round pick a year ago, plus Terrence McGee and Troy Pope and J.D. McKissick and Kelvin Taylor and Trey Madden and George Farmer, and now adding to that competition is going to be Chris Carson, a running back out of Oklahoma State, the 249th overall pick, the Seahawks' last pick, another pick that they got in a trade that otherwise, a trade that didn't matter to them. They could move down a little bit and pick up a 6th-round pick from Atlanta, and they pick up 7th-round pick from Atlanta, and they pick up Chris Carson, running back out of Oklahoma State. Rob, I know that the Big 12 doesn't play defense, but even then, Chris Carson, he didn't have a ton of production, in terms of being a full-time running back starter, but he did have 6.8 yards per carry, and he scored 10 touchdowns on a very limited amount of touches. So what are your thoughts on Chris Carson?
I really like this pick. After the combine, we did it a year ago, and we kind of went through the players that actually fit Seattle's type of running back. They have a very specific type. We've talked about this a lot. It's about 5'10", 6 foot. In height, it's about 220 pounds. It's not really about the speed and the 40-yard dash. It's more about explosion. So it's like the vertical and the broad jump. That's kind of the most important thing, like explosive, physical running backs of a certain size. And last year we had a look, and there was the guy who went to Baltimore, whose name I've forgotten, and there was who was the Louisiana Tech running back, and there was CJ Procise, who fit the kind of profile the Seahawks have looked for. They drafted CJ Procise, did the same at the combine this year, and once again, there were not many running backs that kind of fit the profile the Seahawks were looking for. There was like Alvin Kamara at Tennessee. There was Brian Hill at Wyoming, and there was Chris Carson at Oklahoma State. And they were kind of the three names that were focused on after the combine because of that reason. And Carson is the pick in the 7th round. You know, they've got him in a different kind of range to Hill and Kamara. You know, I think they may have quite liked Brian Hill. There was something about John Schneider saying, "Oh, there was guys that we like, you know, came off the board, and we were a bit frustrated about that." And he also talked about his frustration about not having a 5th round pick. And I do wonder if Brian Hill was somebody they would have considered in that range. But they get Chris Carson, and I just, you know, the way you watch him play, and you know, he hasn't played a ton of games and hasn't had a huge workload in college, but he runs with toughness. He's very explosive. You do sort of see some really nice plays from him, and I think he's probably got a lot, you know, less tread on the tires than a lot of other running backs. So he will come in, and presumably he's going to push the likes of Alex Collins to make a roster spot here. But he's the type of player that you could imagine having a good preseason. You could imagine getting some traction. You can imagine maybe just sort of sneaking onto the roster. So he's somebody to keep an eye on there. I think that this is a good value pick. You know, it's a 7th round pick with somebody who's got a chance to stick. And again, at this stage in the draft, you're not going to be drafting, you know, regular Pro Bowlers in the 7th round. You know, that very rarely happens. You just hope that the guy has a chance to make the roster and compete. And if they end up being really good off the back of that, then great. But Chris Carson is certainly somebody who, you know, you would hope is gonna have a chance to compete and maybe make the roster for sure.
And speaking of making the roster, undrafted free agents make the roster in Seattle all the time, and there's plenty of those that we're talking about right now at this very moment in terms of the Seahawks signing, whether it's rumors or just tryouts, invites. Not a ton of confirmations going around though, and some you know, some that are very solid confirmations. And you know, if you look in the past, we're talking about Doug Baldwin, Thomas Rawls, Deshaun Shedd, Michael Bennett, Mike Morgan, Jermaine Kearse, Tanner McAvoy, Trevone Boykin, Tyvis Powell, DeAndre Elliott, George Fant, and so on. The undrafted free agents in Seattle compete, and often you can bet on 2 or 3 making the final roster, and maybe one of those having a high impact. Sometimes it takes a couple years for that to come to fruition, and sometimes it doesn't in the case of Baldwin or Rawls. So the Seahawks are certainly active out there right now. And you know, the latest that I've seen since we've started this podcast is Al Riles, wide receiver at Louisiana, just 5'9", 204 pounds. But they've added 2 other receivers, Darius Rogers at USC and Jordan Simone from Arizona State, plus Tyrone Swoops, who was a quarterback at Texas, who has converted to tight end. And if you look at his measures and speeds, is pretty close to that of David Njoku of Miami, albeit without any experience. Rob, in terms of the offensive weapons that the Seahawks have reportedly signed, not any guarantees there between those guys, as well as the quarterback Skylar Howard. They've also had a tryout invite for Ronald Butler, quarterback at Tennessee State, which I'm sure not many people have much of a background on. But as we're going through these undrafted free agents, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, some of them, the guard from Purdue, they seem to be quite keen to bring him in. I think he had 42 bench reps, which is incredibly powerful and strong. And you know, they've tried guys like this in the past in camps and stuff like that, and you know, try to find these guys that can stick. So he's going to be interesting. You know, they highlight these undrafted free agents. Darius Rogers, you know, is going to come in and probably compete with the receiver they're taking in the 7th round. You know, they've had guys in the free agents, you know, have stuck before: Ricardo Lockhead, Doug Baldwin, Jermaine Kearse. So, you know, there's opportunities there for wide receivers to come in and have a big impact. Swopes is an interesting one because, you know, he did show some talent at Texas, you know, as a kind of a occasional running back occasional quarterback, and he's got this great frame and great athleticism, and he actually could make this work as a tight end. That is a really interesting. It's going to be so much fun to see the first few days of camp and see how he's getting on and seeing if he can have a bit of an impact there, because he's got the frame and everything, just hasn't played the position. So, you get him in and just sort of have a look at him and see that. There's some other guys that they're bringing. You just mentioned the receiver there. It looks as if he's signing. It looks as if they're bringing a fullback in, which is a need as well. And there's going to bring some competition in now. They also have a bit of camp room free. So if they wanted to sign another veteran, they've got the potential to do that. I just wonder whether or not, the fullback position is one where a veteran comes in now. They've kind of seen who they've been able to get in the draft, and now is an opportunity over the next couple of weeks to sort of reassess the veteran options out there and bring one or two guys in. But they're going to have probably look at this rookie minicamp first, see who they like, see who they want to keep around, have a good look at this tryout, and then make a decision off the back of that.
Well, I mean, we've hit the end of day 3. We're going through undrafted free agents. We've pretty much hit the end of the draft, and all of the notable players that the Seahawks will add or, get rid of, in this case, not get rid of in terms of Richard Sherman, we're set, in terms of what the Seahawks are rolling with into the 2017 season. We are, 90% of the way, 95% of the way in terms of players being on the roster that will be on the roster there. We don't know which ones will get released or which players will have good mini camps, good, sort of off season, good training camp, good preseason. And we don't know who's going to be starting at multiple positions. But we do know who their class is, including Malik McDowell, defensive tackle, Ethan Posick, center, guard, tackle, Shaquille Griffin, cornerback, Delano Hill, safety, and I think they also said they'll play him at multiple defensive back positions, including maybe cornerback, Nazir Jones, defensive tackle again, Amara Darbo, wide receiver, Tedric Thompson, safety, Mike Tyson, safety, cornerback, Justin Senior, offensive line, David Moore, wide receiver, and Chris Carson, running back, plus the undrafted free agents that we just mentioned. Rob, we knew what their needs were heading into the draft in terms of offensive line, cornerback, defensive tackle, like interior pass rush, that kind of thing. They addressed their interior pass with McDowell, a high upside, maybe a top 5 guy on tape for some people out there. And they've backed up that a little bit with Naz Jones, another defensive tackle. They've hit their secondary. They didn't do it early, but they hit it hard with Shaq and Delano Hill and Tedric Thompson and Mike Tyson. And they're going to continue to do so through probably the undrafted free agents and just sort of get the best out of what they can get back there. Maybe some of the things that we don't know yet are some of the, backup linebacker or, Sam linebacker, some of those other things going on. Which wide receivers will wind up there? Are they going to add another tight end, or are they happy with the 3 they've got right now and going in with that? But overall, Rob, if you look at this class from what you had thought, perhaps say on Thursday morning compared to Saturday, now that we know all the draft players, all the draft picks have been made, what are your overall feelings about this draft class by the Seattle Seahawks? Given that you've known what John Schneider and Pete Carroll's tendencies are, any surprises, any negative feelings that are worrying you, or overwhelmingly positive feelings about any of the prospects in particular and the needs that Seattle has?
No, but look, I mean, I think there's I don't like to spend that much time on Twitter sort of looking at the reactions to these things, because NFL fans and the Twitter experts are kind of very sensitive about their opinions, and they suddenly believe that they're the smartest people in the room. And if they don't draft the players that they've spent the last few weeks touting all the time, then they tend to overreact and become really negative and start complaining and saying silly things like, "Well, why don't they draft some good players?" I find that really tiresome, quite frankly, and I'd much rather spend time trying to understand what the Seahawks have done, trying to sort of look at the players that they brought in and working out who they are and what they like about them, and trying to focus on the positive things. Because at the end of the day, your opinion might be the Seahawks have not had very good drafts over the last few years. This is still the same front office that drafted Russell Wilson. It's the same front office that drafted Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor and KJ Wright and all of those other great players. it's still the team that manages to find these little, diamonds in the rough every now and again. And, I just, this idea that, in 2010 and 2011, they could do all this and they can't do it now, I just find that a little bit silly. It's still a really good front office. It's a front office that, is the envy of many teams in the league. So I'd rather sort of give them the benefit of the doubt here and have a look at the players that they've drafted and actually sort of think positively about this team moving forward, because there's going to be plenty of time in the season to talk about what they are and what they aren't doing when the football begins. So what have they done in this draft? Well, for me, it's a case of they've built up the trenches. If you look at the picks, the high picks that they've spent on the O-line and the D-line over the last 4 drafts now, it's extensive. So in 2014, Justin Britt for the O-line, Cassius Marsh was a defensive lineman when they drafted him in round 4. 2015, Frank Clark round 2, Terry Poole and Mark Glowinski in round 4. Last year it was Jermaine Ifedi round 1, Jaron Reed round 2, Reese Odiambo round 3, and then this year we see Malik McDowell in round 1, Ethan Posick in round 2, and Naz Jones in round 3. There is a real trend here that over the last 4 years, the Seahawks have decided that they're going to go with that fabled football rhetoric, which is build in the trenches. They want to be tough. They want to be physical. I don't think it's a surprise, because this is a team that has to face Aaron Donald twice a year. This is a team that up until recently has faced Calais Campbell twice a year. This is a team that struggles against the Rams purely because of a defensive line that has lost games to a Rams team that had no quarterback, no offense to speak of, no secondary, but had a great defensive line, and that seemed to be enough. They keep losing games at home to Arizona because they can't pressure Carson Palmer, and they just wilt under the pressure of Arizona's defensive line and their creative blitzers. So I think they're pretty sick of that. And I think they realize that if they're going to take the next step and get back to where they were in 2013, they're going to do it with a great defensive line, and they're going to do it by being at the very least competent on the offensive line, which is what they were in 2013. So they bring in Posick, a very versatile guy. They bring in Malik McDowell, the kind of player that people have been crying out for so long. And like, this is what I don't understand. It's like, I've been as critical, Kenny, we've talked about Malik McDowell, and you know how critical I've been of him and how I didn't think he was going to be a Seahawk at all. I think that you reminded me of the comment that I used. Wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole or something was what I said to you a few weeks ago. And that's because of the character and the personality and the way that he played did not scream Seahawks. But now that they've taken him, you sort of say, okay, so why did they take him? Because he's incredibly unique. There are very few players like him in the NFL, period. There's probably about 5 maximum. And if he works out, the Seahawks will be the envy of the league again, because they will have been the ones that took a chance on this guy. And they back themselves to get these unique players in, coach them up. I mean, like, would you rather have a solid, safe player drafted at 26 who might only be decent as a kind of a ceiling or reasonably good as a ceiling? Or would you rather the Seahawks trade down, get all of these picks, and take someone who could be outstanding? I mean, isn't this the thing? Isn't it? If you go back, I went back in January and had a look at what people were saying after the Seahawks lost against Atlanta in the playoffs, and everybody was saying the biggest need is interior pass rush. They need to get an interior pass rusher. That has to be the key. They need to improve the offensive line. And they could do with some depth in the secondary and defensive back room. And that's exactly what they've done. And I think the problem, we've all kind of fallen into this trap that since January, when they lost to the Falcons, up until last week, because all of the talk has been, this is a great cornerback class, this is a great safety class, we've kind of all talked ourselves into thinking the Seahawks have to take cornerbacks and safeties very early, when actually what they needed, and what we were talking about at the start of this process, was interior pass rush, get some secondary depth. That is exactly what they have done. This is what people in January were asking them to do. So I think when you look at this draft class, you kind of have to remember stuff like that. I think the McDowell pick is going to be exciting to see if it works out. And it might not work out. He might be another Percy Harvin, Kristen Michael type. That's entirely possible. But he may be absolutely fantastic. And he's got that potential. So let's see how that goes. Posick, I think, is a good hedge for the future. If they don't want to spend $8 million on Justin Britt next year, they've got a guy who's going to be potentially starting at center in a year's time, who's not a rookie. They can plug him in there in a position this year, and they clearly very much like him. They spoke very positively about him. I managed to watch a little bit of Naz Jones today. like his toughness, like his potential. He's somebody who can prevent them from having to go down the Tony McDaniel route again. He's going to come in there. And then, Shaq Griffin is one of the most athletic, explosive cornerbacks in the class. And they've took some safety depth as well. And they've got a receiver from Michigan who is incredibly athletic and has got a fantastic backstory and is the definition of a Seahawks type of player. So, people are going to be negative about it. They will pick through the different draft classes that they like. I like Carolina's draft class. Carolina were picking in the top 10. The Seahawks were picking at 26. It's a big difference, especially when you're picking that in that stage in every single round. And I think from what the Seahawks had at their disposal and the kind of needs that they had, it might not be the sexiest draft class that they're ever going to have under Pete Carroll and John Schneider, but it certainly makes a lot of sense.
Amen. I would agree with, pretty much everything that you said. I liked what you said in the beginning, too, about Twitter experts and whatnot, just in the sense of something else I said recently, which was just that, just in terms of whether it's a draft analyst or just analyzing anything in terms of what's going to happen in the future. I won't take a person seriously if they tell me, oh, that's wrong, that player's no good, bad pick. And it's like, we don't have any idea. We're all out here making our best guess. And if it's anything, I would say you go out there and you go, I dislike this pick because this is why I think this pick was not going to work because, and having the humility to say, I could be wrong. And if you're a Seahawks fan, if you're talking about a Seattle pick, especially saying, I hope I'm wrong, just to look at the picks and say, like, I hope if you don't like it, I hope I'm wrong. And if you like it, I hope I'm right. And for me, I definitely, when I said my ideal pick going into the draft, I said TJ Watt because I didn't want another offensive guard. I didn't want another, just sort of a ho-hum pick. And Malik McDowell fills that. He fills that need to have a player that's an actually explosive, high ceiling type player. And in terms of his concerns with character and whatnot, we're talking about a guy who might be lazy, who might not love football. We're not talking about a guy who hit a woman, and we're not talking about a guy with an extensive criminal record. So, it's a worthy chance, I think, to take on a player who, as you said, is one of the most unique defensive line athletes and physical specimens in the NFL. And the players that do have his size and speed and athleticism, it's usually reserved for the best pass rushing defensive tackles in the NFL. And my other probably favorite pick would be Darboh. Very interested to see how that goes. I think the Seahawks need to make more moves at wide receiver so that they can get away from Jermaine Kearse. They made a couple pretty good ones. I'm intrigued by David Moore. We don't know how that's going to go, but I'm definitely very intrigued as far as a 7th round pick goes. So, I think I like those moves, and many of the others. I really liked the 4th round pick, and I think that in general, many of the other picks were somewhat ho-hum for me, but at least you get that exciting pick with the top at 35 with Malik McDowell, and then a few other later interesting, exciting athletic picks like Darboh and like David Moore and like Carson. So it's a good draft, I think, in terms of if you like competition, if you like a lot of new names. The Seahawks didn't go out and get that one guy to fix their need at cornerback. They got 3 guys to compete, and that's what Pete Carroll does. It's a proven methodology for Pete Carroll, and it's better than saying, and having your mock draft out there with your list of needs and saying, round 1, Seahawks, Kevin King, fixed problem, as opposed to what the Seahawks do, which is let's trade down 3 times, pick up 4 more picks, take 3 extra shots at this thing, because 1st round picks and 3rd round picks, especially if you're doing a late 1st round or a 3rd round, especially in a class like this, I think you'd rather have multiple shots at it rather than saying, well, I think this is our best shot at it, and that's not what they do. They bring in guys. They didn't sign Matt Flynn and not draft Russell Wilson. They didn't not sign Matt Flynn and draft Russell Wilson. They did both, and that's why these moves work out. And then I definitely think, in terms of defensive tackle, you wouldn't have think they were going to take 3 or 2 on day 2, but they did. And, that's going to keep continuing to churn that competition, and we'll see how things play out because, worst case scenario, maybe not worst case scenario, but there is a scenario where September gets around and they just have more guys than they can put on the roster. Maybe they work out a couple more trades, get some more value for future drafts, and so on, and so be it. Rob, I think, we have fulfilled our promise of a post-draft podcast. Usually I would just go out after you make your final speech like you just did, but then I came in and I talked for way too long, 4 or 5 minutes, more than anyone wants to hear me talk. I'll give you one last chance before we sign out if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Well, I suppose just a couple of quick things. First of all, the interesting bit is that we get to sort of look at the players they've drafted and really focus on players we know that they like and try and look for the things that they like. So that's going to be the focus on the Seahawks draft blog for the next few days. I am then going to take a break for quite some time because people who have followed the blog for a long time will know that my wife gave birth just 3 months ago, and I have to reintroduce myself to my kids and my wife after following this draft class for so much time. But it has been a blast. I want to thank everybody again who's listened to the podcast and has followed the blog on the Seahawks draft blog specifically over the last few weeks. Terrific community. It's been really, really busy again over the last few days. We get a lot of nice comments and a lot of educated football people go on there and talk about things. And I think the great thing is that, and it kind of reminded me how good the community is on there when I've been following Twitter over the last sort of 2 days, because as the Seahawks have been doing what people don't want them to do, or have said, I don't like this, I don't know this person, or this person was available and I like him more, or then they're taking the player that I didn't want them to take. It just comes across like a bit of a spoiled brat. And as you said there, Kenny, I think you nailed it when you said, don't just say, I don't like this. Say, here's why. Here's some detailed reasons why I don't like this. Don't just sort of go along and retweet something you put 6 months ago when they pick someone that you like, or you find out something you like. Give detailed reasons why you were unhappy about something. Otherwise, you just sound like a child. And I think that the great thing about the community is that they avoided doing this. And you can disagree with the pick. You could say, listen, I thought this about Malik McDowell. I'm not particularly happy about this. I'd rather they've taken Kevin King or somebody like that. And here's my reason for that. And it may be because it's a positional thing, or it might be because of something McDowell has shown on tape, but there's an explanation there. And I think that's important when you're going to disagree or agree with anything, that you've got to back up your opinions with detail. So I'm going to reserve judgment on a few of the players. I think, the overall mentality and the plan of the draft class makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned a while ago, in January, I think a lot of people would have said, if you'd have said to people after that Falcons game, the Seahawks are going to draft a dynamic interior pass rusher with their first pick, an offensive lineman with their second pick, and then they're going to load upon defensive backs in the third round. And by the way, they traded down in the first round and got 4 third-round picks. People would be giving them a standing ovation. The reason why they're not getting a standing ovation is because they didn't take a lot of the players that we in the national media have been talking about for the Seahawks over the last few weeks. And if they'd have taken Kevin King with the first pick instead, everyone would have been happy, probably, because he's a name that they're familiar with and he plays at Washington, etc., etc., etc. However, because they've done stuff that the national media hasn't talked about, or at least when people have, like myself, have talked about McDowell in not the most positive terms, they then take a negative approach to this. But I'll just say it one more time to wrap up here, Kenny. If you'd have said to people in January, right after that game, pass rusher, interior pass rusher first pick, offensive line second pick, and a load of depth for the secondary in round 3, and a receiver, everybody would have been happy with that. And that's important to remember before you jump head first into criticizing this draft class.
I love it. Good stuff. And thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to sit by your side for another, metaphorically, thousands of miles apart, for another NFL draft, the 2017 draft from last year, a few weeks after this time to right now. We've been talking about these players and, it's complete. So a good one to cover, a very interesting one. We'll let Rob, I guess he wants to spend time with his family. Look, I can't really I may disagree with that decision. I don't think that Rob should put family over football, especially a draft that's 12 months out. I think it's time to start focusing on that and leave the family stuff to the side. But, that's me. That's just how I operate. So we'll forgive him for now and let him get back to his family. And we'll be back at some point in the near future for another episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft, where we can talk about the Seahawks, where we can talk about the 2018 draft. We can talk about what's going to happen in the next college season. Could be a few weeks. Who knows? Could be a little bit longer. We'll figure that out as we go. Thank you so much for listening to 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten. You can follow us at Field Goals or at Kenneth Arthur S. And just you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. So, and it will be back at some point. And thank you so much for tuning in. Good stuff for the Seahawks and for all these good kids in general. This has been one edition of the podcast. Come back when it comes back next time for a brand new draft. And I do mean brand new because it'll be 2018 draft.